Welcome, everyone. It has been 10 years since the first Richard P. Howard lecture was given in 2012. We are so fortunate to have with us this evening Richard and Barbara Howard. Dick, along with his wife Barbara, are the reason we are sitting here this evening. At their invitation, 14 history-minded people gathered at their home on September 18th, 1972, and the beginnings of the John Whitmer Historical Association were born. Richard is Church Historian Emeritus for Community of Christ. He served as Church Historian from 1966 to 1994. He is a past president of both JWHA and the Mormon History Association. In our most recent journal that you probably picked up this evening, you will find his groundbreaking article, The Changing RLDS Response to Mormon Polygamy, a Preliminary Analysis. Thank you for being with us this evening. Our lecturer this evening is Dr. Amy DeRogatis. She is Professor of Religion and American Culture and Chair of the Department of Religious Studies at Michigan State University. She is author of Saving Sex, Sexuality, and Salvation in American Evangelicalism from Oxford Press 2015, and Moral Geography, Maps, Missionaries, and the American Frontier from Columbia University Press in 2003, and numerous articles and essays on religion, sexuality, and gender. She is currently at work on a third book, Mormon King, about James Jesse Strang and the Strangite community on Beaver Island, Michigan. Dr. DeRogatis, welcome.
Thank you so much, and what a pleasure it is to be here, and I'm so happy that I got to see the Howards before starting today. It's just a total joy to be with you tonight, and I'm just really honored, so thank you. So let me get started. An image has been on my mind for many years. The image that sits on my desk is a printed copy of a digital photo of a daguerreotype of Elvira Eliza Field, the first plural wife of the Prophet James Jesse Strang. Field is dressed as Charles J. Douglas, or Charley, as Field was called, for 6 months during fall 1849 and spring 1850. Elvira Field, a young Mormon woman from Michigan, secretly married Strang on July 13, 1849, and traveled with him later that year on an East Coast church mission. Dressed as his fictitious nephew, Field served as Strang's personal secretary and close confidant during the mission. The original photograph is housed in special collections in the Clark Historical Library at Central Michigan University in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. Digital copies of the image are all over the internet, and reproductions may be found in public archives, books, and personal holdings. I came across this image early in my research on James Jesse Strang. Anyone who has spent time on the topic of 19th-century Mormons who followed Strang has seen a copy. Over the past few years, I've used it in public talks and in teaching. For me, the image serves as an entryway into a fascinating religious movement that culminated in the crowning of a Mormon king, the proclaimed true successor of the prophet Joseph Smith, on a remote island in the middle of Lake Michigan. Strang's story is rich with metallic plates, angel visitations, visions, secret rituals, new scripture, political intrigue, and obviously scrappy fights with Brigham Young. As you know, when Joseph Smith, the prophet and founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was shot in June 1844, the Mormon community was left without an obvious successor. The turmoil and uncertainty of the succession crisis in the early days after Smith died created a space for a leadership contest. James Strang, a recent convert, saw and spoke with angels, found buried brass plates with new scripture, and received a highly contested letter of appointment from Joseph Smith. Strang, who initially distinguished himself from his fiercest competitor, Young, by rejecting plural marriage, would eventually convince many people of his rightful position and lead a large group to Beaver Island, Michigan, where he sought to establish a millennial kingdom. While on Beaver Island, he crowned himself king, built a tabernacle, established what he called the law of the Lord, and instituted plural marriage. He was also elected to the Michigan House of Representatives 2 times. For many reasons, he angered Gentiles living on Beaver Island, Mackinac Island, and what is now called Charlevoix in northern Michigan. A few disaffected followers with the implicit support of the federal government assassinated him in 1856. Within a few weeks, all of his followers were forcibly removed from the island and their land and property repossessed by the mob that pushed them out. James Strang's vision of himself as prophet and king was deeply millennial. He sought to create a kingdom of God on earth with himself as God's representative monarch. He wasn't the only religious leader seeking to create the kingdom of God on earth in 19th century America. Besides the prophet Joseph Smith, John Humphrey Noyes of the Oneida Perfectionists, the followers of Ann Lee, commonly known as the Shakers, Ellen White and the Seventh-day Adventists, and other religious groups experimented with communal living, marriage, sexual practices, work and dress habits as they sought to usher in the kingdom of God. Mystics experienced ecstatic visions, and unlikely leaders, including women and children, produced new religious texts and rituals. This tremendous religious activity spread across frontier communities and focused on the effort to perfect bodies and souls while believers waited for the millennium to arrive. Prophets roamed the landscape, visionaries predicted the end of the world, and ordinary people abandoned their families to join spiritual communities that offered new structures of belief and practice. In the early and mid-19th century, the Great Lakes region was fertile ground for these types of groups. Strang's communal religious experience, though small and short-lived, is a subject of a few biographical and historical studies. For the most part, the scholarship focuses on Strang's biography, politics around Strang, the rise and fall of the community, and Strang's place in early Mormon and regional history. The part of the story that first captured my and continues to hold my attention is young Elvira Field living in public as a man for half a year. Specifically, my interest centers on the remarkable image. Field's direct stare and almost indecipherable smirk, to my mind, encapsulates the hubris of Strang's public anti-polygamy platform and his enormous ambition to achieve his extraordinary aspirations. I have many questions about the image. Why call attention to her disguised self by sitting for a photograph? Who kept the photo? How was it displayed? In the early Mormon world of visions, angels, and spectral revelation, how did this visual image operate? Was it used as physical, empirical evidence of what was not, by historical accounts, a completely believable ruse? Or was it simply a private joke shared among lovers? For all of my interest in the photograph, I had never considered the possibility that it could be someone other than Elvira Eliza Field. Thus, it came as a surprise when I read a comment on a Mormon podcast site a few years ago challenging provenance of the Daguerreotype. What would it mean if the photograph was misidentified and was simply an unknown, dapper antebellum man? Did it change the story? Regardless of provenance, what role has this image played in directing my research and scholarship about the movement? Will I tell the same story if this image is not Elvira Eliza Field? So tonight, I focus on one image to consider the role of visual evidence and optical technologies played in this early Mormon group. I'm particularly interested in the way that seeing operated to support believing. I'm equally concerned, however, in the methodological question of how the image operated on me, directing my research and maintaining my interest. Visual material objects like this photograph provide an entryway into religious worldviews and practices, Portrait photographs, like this daguerreotype, capture representations of specific individuals, but also provide a general view of a historical time and place. So, as religious studies scholar Rachel McBride Lindsay argues in her beautiful book, she states, more than documents of religious practice, figures, or events, commonplace photographs brokered the religious worlds their beholders inhabited. Focusing specifically on vernacular or commonplace photographs like the Douglas daguerreotype, Lindsay demonstrates that 19th century Americans developed modes of perception and reception that she calls beholding. Beholding refers to the complex relationship between what people saw and imagined as they held a photograph and the ways the specific material object carried religious meaning. Quote, among 19th century Americans, photographs were beheld as relics as well as icons. Beholders of vernacular photographs developed habits of seeing that cherish the materiality of the object while acknowledging the religious reality beyond its physical surface. The Douglas portrait was taken during a secret transitional theological moment that would change the sexual and social experiences of Strang's followers. The photograph documents this shift, but it may not have had any role in it. Ultimately, the image ended up in an archive collection among curated papers and a photo album that provide an explanatory context for what may or may not be Elvira Eliza Field dressed as Charles Douglas. So, to interpret the image, I'm going to attend to the historical and religious context of early Mormonism, look at antebellum female cross-dressers, and think about new technologies. I also employ Lindsay's useful concept of beholding, paying close attention to my own practice of beholding, as well as the contemporaries. The story I tell relies in part on conjecture and imagination, and is shaped by the curation of archives that house the photograph and all the other textual documents. So along with the fascinating story of the religious movement as told through an image, I extend the interpretation to take seriously how beholding a visual object directed my research. All right, so you all know this, but I'm going to tell you anyway. James Jesse Strang grew up in Western New York in early 19th century. In his youth, he kept a secret personal diary written partially in code in which he expressed the desire to attain fame and power by marrying royalty. Although a Baptist, he described himself in this diary as a cool philosopher and a freethinker. Eventually, he would practice law, serve as a county postmaster, edit a newspaper, and distinguish himself as a debate champion and lecturer on temperance. He married Mary Peirce in 1836, and within 12 years, they had 4 children. In February of 1844, so winter of 1844, Strang traveled to Nauvoo, Illinois, converted to Mormonism, was baptized by Joseph Smith, and ordained by Smith's brother Hiram. Strang was then commissioned by Smith to set up a stake in his new home, which would be called Foree, near Burlington, Wisconsin. A few months later, Joseph Smith was dead. In fairly short order, newly converted Strang set out to claim the mantle of the prophet. To accomplish this, Strang reported that at the moment of Joseph Smith's death, he received a visit from an angel who ordained him. He also received a letter of appointment that Strang alleged was written by Joseph Smith. While many people disputed the authenticity of the letter, others were convinced that the letter proved Strang's authority. It was one piece of material evidence, this letter, that directly linked him to Smith's desire to name him as a successor. Strang's visual and spiritual experiences with angels, as well as his ability to find and translate buried plates, which would happen soon after, demonstrates his prophetic character. Equally important, Strang disavowed spiritual wifery, as plural marriage was also called, setting himself apart from Brigham Young. The Mormon community was, as you know, was deeply divided on whether polygamy was sanctioned, and many of Strang's earliest followers joined his group because of his vocal opposition to plural marriage. Strang gathered his small community in Foree, Wisconsin, but within 4 years, he moved the headquarters to Beaver Island, Michigan. And it's in this transitional moment that he first sets eyes on the 18-year-old Miss Field. Elvira Eliza Field was a seamstress and school teacher in Eaton Rapids, Michigan, who met Strang's missionaries in the winter of 1847. In April 1848, with her parents and brother, she attended a conference in Voree, and a year later, the family moved to Beaver Island. That summer, one of Strang's close and colorful associates, George Adams, delivered a marriage proposal on Strang's behalf, explaining that soon James Strang would establish a divine kingdom on Beaver Island, and he had picked Field to be his first plural wife and queen of the kingdom. According to Adams, this new order was divinely revealed to Strang, and so a marriage took place somewhere in Michigan on July 13th, 1849. So Strang arranged for his new wife to accompany him on an East Coast missionary trip. From September 1849 to March 1850, Elvira Eliza Field traveled with Strang disguised as his nephew. To accomplish this feat, Field cut her hair, dressed in men's clothing, adopted masculine mannerisms. Dressing as Douglas, Field understood her ruse as an important step in the building of Strang's millennial kingdom. Many years later, in an interview with one of Field and Strang's sons, Clement stated that Strang had encouraged Elvira to disguise herself because church members were not yet ready for plural marriage, and he did not want them to know that he was traveling with a woman. Scholars have debated the reasons why Strang changed his position on plural marriage, and for whatever those reasons were for the reversal, they initially kept it secret, and for 6 months, Field dressed as a man. So now we get into provenance and the question of authenticity. At some point during the 6 months, Elvira Eliza Field, dressed as Charley Douglas, might have visited a daguerreotypist and commissioned an image of herself. So by 1849, the photographic technique developed by French painter Louis-Jacques Daguerre of using chemical mixtures to fix images on silver copper plates became a popular form of portraiture in America. Although Daguerre himself preferred to photograph inanimate objects, early American photographers quickly seized on the commercial possibilities, opening studios in cities such as Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Buffalo, where Field's son Clement Strang thought she might have had the image taken. So the daguerreotype in question is about 2 3/4 by 3 1/4 inch size. It is in a hinged square wooden case covered with maroon tooled leather. The case opens up to reveal the daguerreotype in a gold frame on the right side, and then a maroon velvet cushion on the left. When it's closed, it's like an inch thick. In the archives, there's a slip of paper with the daguerreotype that states, and you can see it up here, Elvira, I'm sorry, I took some of these pictures, so, bear with me. Elvira Field, Charles Douglas's wife, James J. Strang, married when they were married. And then it says the picture was probably taken in New York State in the early part of 1850. That conflicts with what Clement says. And also you'll notice it comes from the collection of C.W. Ellison. So in this collection, there are 2 other daguerreotypes of Strang family members that were deposited, with the one attributed to Field as Douglas. Also in the collection, but deposited from a different source, is the Strang daguerreotype by Aitken that was taken in 1856. So these 4 daguerreotype cases resemble each other, but they're not identical. They were definitely taken at different times. We definitely know the Strang one was in 1856, and they were probably all taken with different photographers. So for example, there's a daguerreotype of Sarah Wright, the fourth wife of James Strang, with her son James, who was born in 1856. So that would have been 7 years later than if the Douglas one is correct. And the other image is of Sarah's parents, the Apostle Phineas and his wife Amanda Wright. So these two with the Charley Douglas came together. The first two are positively identified, and they match photos in the family album. There's no dispute. The only image in question is the one of Field dressed as Douglas. So the three images were purchased from Charles W. Ellison. Who is this person? Well, he worked in Lansing as a government stenographer, who was also the proprietor of Ellison Bookshop and became the president of the Michigan Historical Commission and the Michigan Historical Society. In the fall of 1941, he reached out to Clement Strang, this child of Elvira and James, requesting that Clement provide information about his family and childhood for an upcoming talk that Ellison was giving. So by the time that he reaches out to Clement, in 1941, we know that Clement had what he describes as a picture of my mother as she was attired when she accompanied my father as a private secretary. We know he had this. Because it's in a letter dated in 1938, he sent the Daguerreotype that he had to Stanley Johnston, who was in the Strang community, and asked him to make copies and keep the negative. Clement died in 1944, so it's sometime between 41 and when sometime after 41, Ellison was able to get it because he sold it to the Clark Historical Society in 1960. So that collection of three daguerreotypes were sold together, and they were sold by Ellison. So I want to say thanks to Vicki Speak for pointing me to another letter from the Stanley Johnson confirming that Clement's photo was in the Clark Historical Society. There's been a lot of digging around about who gave what when, but this I'm sure of, that Clement had a daguerreotype. I'm sure it ended up with Ellison, and Ellison sold it to the Historical Society. But I don't know if that object that Clement had was, in fact, Elvira Field. Okay, so here I'd like to pause and consider the question. Without definitive corroborating evidence that this image is indeed Elvira Field, how should I interpret this material object? Historian Martha A. Sandweiss in Print the Legend warns that although photographs are rich primary sources, they can be deceptive. They are rarely clear answers to interpretive questions about historical photographs. Asking questions of and about an image within its specific historical, cultural, and religious context allows us to imagine what role the image played when it was taken, but also requires us to remain aware that the meaning of the photograph has changed and will be reinterpreted over time. Sandweiss cautions us that there's a difference between our reading of a historical photograph and the responses of the original audience. The gap is also instructive for the researcher. She says, quote, "Our needs for an image, whether we approach it as a historian, a filmmaker, a collector, a family member, are always and necessarily different from the needs of the picture's creator, its subjects, or its original audiences." So, if this is an image of Elvira Eliza Field, what were the needs of the picture's creator? And how did the image function in the visual culture of Strang's movement? Without a diary entry, letter, or other primary document that would explain Field's reasons for taking the photograph, I'm left with questions and conjecture. Did Field hope that seeing a photograph of herself dressed as Douglas would help her to fully embody the role? When the photograph was taken, did the couple believe that Field would live as a man for a while and would need to document her life as Douglas? In what way did this image help Strang and Field and perhaps the whole community? I suspect, At the very least, being photographed as a man made real for Field, Strang, and anyone who viewed the image what was only a flimsy disguise with clothing. The Daguerreotype, whatever other purpose it may have served, provide physical and visual evidence that legitimized both Field's transformation into Douglas and ultimately Strang's theological and prophetic claims. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that Strang and Field might have desired visual proof of the authenticity of both. Optical evidences were, after all, at the heart of early Mormonism. Early Mormon texts taught readers how to see and decipher visual spectral phenomenon. According to the historian Mason Allred, when the prophet Joseph Smith described seeing angels, used seer stones to interpret golden plates, and included eyewitness testimonies in a new printed Bible, he was training his followers to decipher spectral evidence through new technologies of observation. In the context of 19th-century cultural interests in contacting ghosts and spirits with new technologies, including photography and telegraphy, not to mention all the spiritualists who are working on those techniques, Smith was able to translate his visions through the medium, the text, that was fixed and shareable. But how could such fantastic spectral claims be believed? So new optical technologies such as the microscope and stereoscope, as well as an increased interest in evidence and observation, were part of larger cultural shifts in discerning truth from deception. In an era when new technologies were enabling disembodied communication across time and space, like the telegraph, the appeal to sensory evidence for discerning truth through touch and sight bridged a gap between the spiritual and material worlds. The seer stones Joseph Smith used to translate his golden plates, Allred explains, operated almost like a folk technology comparable to optical machines of the day. Similarly, the veracity of angelic visitations and the description of the physicality of the golden plates achieved permanence when printed in a book with accompanying eyewitness testimonies. What might have been interpreted as Smith's fleeting, subjective, and possibly unbelievable set of spiritual experiences was transformed into a model for seeing that valued observation, objects' physicality, testimony, and material technologies to bridge the gap between the visible and invisible worlds. And I'd like to add that the camera does this too, because unlike portraiture that can be subjective or, be out of the sort of ideas of the human who's painting it, the camera in the early 19th century was seen as, fact, that it was the actual representation and it was the truth of how somebody looked. James Strang also saw angels, received revelation found in translated brass plates. On many occasions, he encouraged disbelievers to see the material evidence of his claims with their own eyes. For example, Strang freely showed the letter of appointment from Joseph Smith that affirmed his position as prophet. Similarly, Strang produced 2 sets of metal plates that he allowed witnesses to observe them, hold them, and determine their authenticity. He carried the tiny metallic Voree plates with him and showed them freely. On the front page of the Law of the Lord, there are 7 signatures of witnesses who testified, quote, "We have examined them with our eyes and handled them with our hands." As was the case with Smith, doubters questioned the authenticity of the plates, whether or not the plates were a hoax manufactured by Strang, as some of his detractors claimed. But his effort to materialize the supernatural, as religious studies scholar Ann Taves has suggested regarding Joseph Smith's plates, made the revelatory experience real for the community. Smith's material claims created a precedent for Strang's followers to accept the authenticity of physical artifacts. So, material visual evidence of hard-to-believe occurrences brings me back to the image of Elvira Eliza Field. Is this a daguerreotype of Elvira Eliza Field dressed as Charles Douglas? I have not found any definitive evidence in archival records of a visit to a photographer while in disguise, or that she or her contemporaries had a photo. I haven't found it. It might be there, I haven't found it. But remember, there is an archival trail of evidence in letters written by her son Clement, who claimed in 1938 to have a picture of her dressed as the secretary, and guessing that she might have visited a daguerreotypist in New York. So, if she did, there were 11 daguerreotypists listed in the City Directory of Buffalo in 1849 to choose from. Or she could have had her photo taken by Lucian Foster in New York City the following month. So this is the daguerreotypist who must have the most money because has the most advertisements in Buffalo during the fall of 1849. So Lucian Foster was in New York City because he was present at a general conference on October 5th through 7th, and Charley Douglas was there taking notes. We know that he had been a daguerreotypist, but again, I can't find any evidence that he was still working as a photographer in New York City in 1849. He definitely was there, and he stayed in New York City for a while after that. So I really want to right now kind of give a shout out of thanks for the wonderful article that was recently published in your fabulous journal, Hidden Things Shall Come to Light by Ronald Romig and Lack Mackay, because it was in that journal that I read about Lucian Foster. And I also started thinking about sort of connections between questions around the Larsen Smith daguerreotype and Elvira Eliza Field. Also, I want to thank Locke for pointing me to the place in the Herald where we see that Lucian Foster was in New York. So I know you'll hear more about Lucian Foster and that daguerreotype on Saturday. So Clement Strang had a photo, which is likely the same photo purchased by the Clark Historical Library from Ellison, but was Clement misinformed about the photo he believed was his mother? Perhaps. If the photo is authentic, the interesting question is why? Why would Elvira have visited a daguerreotypist? So, Strang presented material evidence of a letter of appointment and metal plates for supporters and detractors to see for themselves. It is possible that he might have encouraged Field to create a portrait of herself as a form of a proof of transformation. After all, the new photographic technologies were understood to present and fix reality in an object that could be shared and viewed multiple times and span distances and carried during travel. Once taken, the Douglas daguerreotype might have become a type of evidence that could present a more reliable deception than the everyday work of living in a disguise. Whether or not the image is authentic, Field dressed as a man to hide the secret of her marriage. We could interpret the cross-dressing as simply a unique event related to Strang's changing stance in plural marriage, but there's more to think about when we remember that for 6 months, Field did not just dress as a man, she acted as a man, and as a close male relative to the prophet. In that respect, Field's cross-dressing should be considered in the context of other female religious actors and leaders who challenged gender norms through cross-dressing, rejecting sexual expectations, or transcending gender altogether. American religious history is replete with women who challenged earthly expectations of female behavior and ability through spiritual inspiration that sometimes involved name-changing in a really good costume. I'm not suggesting that Field was the equivalent of somebody like Jemima Wilkinson or other 19th century female visionaries who founded and led religious groups. Field's cross-dressing, however, should be understood in the context of crossing ritual, social, and marital boundaries by means of gender transgression. There are plenty of well-known examples of 19th century women who dressed as men as a strategy to accomplish a goal, such as joining a male profession. Others adopted male dress simply to move and speak in male public spaces. Some of these cross-dressing women were photographed. The most documented group were Civil War soldiers who lived and fought as men during the war, and some continued to do so afterwards. I'd be remiss not to say that many of the people who were cross-dressing were enslaved people who were using cross-dressing as a way of escaping slavery. Field cross-dressed as Charley Douglas to achieve the goal of living with her secret husband. We don't know anything other than that about her temporary transformation. But if we allow that Field embraced her dual identity, she might have visited a photographer to document her temporary moment of liberation, a literal mirror vision of her authentic self captured for eternity. In that material object, the cross-dressed Field also represents a moment that historian Marjorie Garber terms a category crisis for Strang's movement that was in the process of transitioning from monogamy to plural marriage. So, cross-dressing in 1849 was risky business. In some cities, it was a crime. For example, in 1848, Columbus, Ohio passed an ordinance to make it a crime for a person to appear in public, quote, in a dress not belonging to his or her sex. In 1845, a New York state law prohibited people from being in public spaces disguised. And these laws will continue and increase in the 1850s, especially in the western states. So calling attention to herself as a woman dressed as a man could have landed Field in jail, exacted a steep fine, or potentially led to violence. So it's remarkable that Elvira Eliza Field dressed as a man for 6 months, but it is even perhaps more remarkable that she acted as a man in a religious group for 6 months. Disguised as Strang's nephew, Field was his personal secretary. She participated in men's discussions and activities. She wrote and submitted articles to the Gospel Herald, and Vicky Speake has speculated that she might have fulfilled some male priesthood obligations. What we know for certain is that as Charley Douglas, she reported to the Gospel Herald on the progress of East Coast missionary work, and she submitted her own writing on theological and social issues. And so you're going to hear more about this tomorrow with Kyle Bashir's talk at 11:15 a.m. Field's most notable writing, in my opinion, in the Gospel Herald was her reporting on accusations leveled against herself. So she's been being called, there are questions about whether she's a man or not, and as a secretary, she's reporting about it and sending it back to the Herald. She's got a lot of spunk. Dressed as Charley Douglas, Field became the object of speculation and the focus of questioning the legitimacy of Strang's prophetic claims. When leaders in the movement accused Douglas of being disguised as a woman, their ire was pointed at Strang, not Field. When they publicly called for an investigation to uncover the truth of Douglas's sex, they were hoping to expose Strang as a hypocrite and a fraud. Revealing that Douglas was a woman would prove false Strang's rejection of plural marriage, a cornerstone of his claim as a legitimate successor to Joseph Smith. So on the one hand, it's remarkable that one person, cross-dressed for 6 months, could potentially dismantle the theological and social structure that supported the burgeoning religious community. Followers who believed the truth of angelic visitations, divine callings, brass plates with scripture, and other miraculous occurrences were ready to abandon the prophet if Charley Douglas were found to be a woman. On the other hand, this was a transitional moment in the movement, and Field dressed as Douglas was the physical embodiment of the pending change. She was the category crisis embodied in Field, and that signaled this theological shift was underway. In later years, Field and Strang's first child, Charles, who, by the way, was named after Field as Charley Douglas, so their first son, named Charles, agreed to publish his father's materials. In a correspondence with Lorenzo Dow Hickey, Charles Strang agreed, quote, to devote all my spare time and money to publishing Strang's virtues as a man and public officer, but I will not write one line or give one penny in defense of his creed. Charles Strang explained that he had been collecting materials for a few years and had recently come across a manuscript that described his mother dressed as Charley. After learning of his mother's disguise, he became convinced that his father was a liar and a theological fraud. It's notable that Charles Strang focuses on his father's deception and the hurt it caused his family and followers, but not his mother's actions. It's also notable that it was much later in his life that he learned of this, because he had been close to his mother for many years. So, the cross-dressing for Charles Strang, the first son, was evidence of deceit that unmasked his father as a false prophet. Although Hickey hoped that Strang and Elvira's firstborn son would agree to serve as the movement's leader, Charles Strang unequivocally declined. Writing in his journal, he stated, "As a successor to J.J. Strang, I have no call, no authority. I'm not fitted. I have no desire to assume the leadership and undertake the call of the faithful together." But in a letter to Hickey that he transcribed in his diary, he made the connection quite clear. Quote, "If you know anything of Charley Douglas, as you certainly must, you can understand why I do not believe in Strangism." So, in the spring of 1850, Field returned to Beaver Island dressed as a woman. Within a few months, in elaborate coronation ceremonies, Strang was crowned king. The congregation affirmed his rule and vowed to keep God's laws in the final kingdom. Following the coronation, Strang acknowledged his marriage to Field, instituted plural marriage, and established the law of the Lord for both believers and Gentiles. Soon after, female saints were required to wear a bloomer-type costume. Adoption of the new female outfit was consistent with trends in women's dress reform. It was consistent with things that were happening in other religious communities, like this one in the 1850s. In the Book of the Law of the Lord, in chapter 39, Apparel and Ornaments, it states there are financial and health reasons why women should shun restrictive fashion and adopt the new costume. Very consistent in these types of groups. But not all Mormon women welcomed the new dress code. We know one woman who embraced it, Elvira Eliza Field. Already accustomed to wearing pants, as Charley Douglas, presumably Field easily adopted the new dress style. But dictating the unfashionable dress reform did not endear Strang to some of the island women, and his insistence on controlling their dress by asking them to wear what they called manly clothes would ultimately lead in part to his demise. So, now the question of authenticity. Many years after Strang's death, Field would sit for another photo. In her late 70s, Elvira was photographed with her second husband, John Baker. She never officially disavowed Strang, but she didn't really affiliate with any other religious group, and according to those who knew her, rarely spoke of her life as Strang's wife or her short period dressed as Charles Douglas. So, inspired by the article in JWHA Journal, I reached out to Locke and I asked him about facial recognition and figuring out authenticity of a daguerreotype. At my own institution, we have an expert in facial recognition and a whole gaggle of graduate students, and they couldn't spend 5 minutes with me. They were not interested. You know, I'm not at the Defense Department. But they did say that they thought it was very hard with the technology when there were so many years to say anything accurate. That's what they reported to me. But, you know, I talked to Locke, and he said, well, why don't you do the free online beta facial recognition, which I did. So what I did is I took a picture, I took the daguerreotype, and then I took the face from the picture that was taken 50 years later, and, or 60, and it came up at 84%. Not terrible, not awesome, right? So, okay. So then I decided, well, I'm gonna do it on myself. And I'm going to try to get a 50-year span at least. So I took a picture of myself as a toddler, and then I took a picture of myself now, and what I got in that span was 65%. But we all know that that's nonsense because I was a 2-year-old in the first picture. So then I said, okay, I'm going to take a picture of myself at Elvira's age, so 19-ish. I think it was 20, so when I was in college, and a picture of myself today. And I have it on my laptop. I'll show it to anybody. You would see that picture tomorrow and say that's Amy DeRogatis. Like, I really look like what I looked like, just old now. And it came back at 83%. I don't know. Not really sure. So there you have it. So I'll let you just sit with that. So the image most associated with Field, if authentic, and I'm going to tell you, I think it is, represents a brief 6 months in a long life lived almost entirely apart from James Jesse Strang and his branch of Mormonism. What then can this visual material object teach us about this religious group or interpretive practices that you might be doing in your own research? Does it matter if this image is authentic? In one sense, it really doesn't. Whether or not this daguerreotype documents it, for 6 months, Field dressed and acted as a man. Field's decision to cross-dress was directly linked to religious controversy around plural marriage and the acceptance of Strang as a true prophet. If it is authentic, there is much to consider regarding the role images and optical evidence plays in legitimizing supernatural phenomena in 19th century religious groups, like this one. Similarly, if this image was circulated as a physical piece of evidence to a truth that Field was indeed Douglas, we learn something about how the use of objects brings us into the everyday practices that support religious claims and beliefs. For Strang and his followers, the truth of his position of the building of the millennial kingdom and the continual revelations that he received was evident to anyone who had hands to touch and circulate material objects and eyes to see. The daguerreotype might have constituted one more piece of visual material evidence that supported Strang's incredible claims. So although provenance of the image remains obscure, the role that the image played in my scholarship is clear. And here I'd like to ask you to think about your own selves as scholars and how you might think about or interact with material objects, particularly images. Not unlike 19th century beholders, my perception and reception of the material object brought me into contact with the body of Elvira Eliza Field. Daguerreotypes are unique images. They're not made or duplicated from film. The body, Field's body, had to be present when the image was made, and the image that we now have. As Lindsay has noted about the power of material conditions of beholding daguerreotypes, I beheld the photograph in a quiet archive over 150 years later when I peered at the mirrored image. So there are specific ways that this photograph directed my interest and interpretation of the movement. As a researcher, I'm also implicated in the pull of visual and material evidence in my interpretation of this religious group. So my attention to Strang's movement was captured and maintained because of the material visual image. It was the daguerreotype that led me to read primary sources to understand how the cross-dressed plural life fit into the larger story of the religious movement. The image prompted me to relate Field to other 19th century cross-dressing women who photograph themselves and think more systematically about how being perceived as a man allows women to participate in practices. Furthermore, the image directed me to incorporate in my analysis the role of material objects and visual culture in the founding of Strang's movement. Finally, just as the camera captures only a portion of reality and directs the viewer to a particular point, I have come to recognize that my focus on 6 months is in a similar sense a distortion. Field lived for 80 years, but lived as a woman in Strang's Mormon group for only about 6 years, and as a man for 6 months. That narrow view captures an extraordinary moment that certainly might distort my vision. And yet, the photograph continues to direct my research. The archive where it resides, the collection, the absences in the collection, actively shapes the story that I tell. This complicated relationship, always nurtured by conjecture and imagination, expanded my understanding of the radical meaning of Field's body. Although I'm pretty convinced that this daguerreotype is indeed Elvira Eliza Field, ultimately what matters is not whether the photograph can be authenticated. It is the power of the image to direct interpretive choices, especially when there's ambiguity in the archives. So I hope that as you think about this and as you think about the talk about the Larsen-Smith daguerreotype, you can ask yourself what the power of images are for you in your research and why authenticity might be important, what it tells you, what it doesn't tell you. So the study of all forms of material religion will be enriched as more scholars like yourself investigate their own complicated relationships with the archives in which they work, specifically paying attention to the generative ways that material objects actively direct their and our research. Thank you.